Okay, so I thought it would be useful to record my first pass projection setup, or at least the development of my first pass setup. And as you can see, I've got this psychedelic loveliness on the screen here, which is essentially my my projections running through the shot camera onto each of the surfaces. Okay, so what I'm going to do, obviously we see all of that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off all except the first image set, which is just the first two buildings. Okay, a little bit fiddly. So these are our first two buildings. So the critical thing with a layered projection is to ensure that all of the projection cameras are derived directly from the shot camera path. So no overscanning, no deviating from the path of the motion shot camera. Okay, so all of these projection cameras have just created an arbitrary set just to go through this, and these are all derived from the camera, from the moving camera's path. They're all at the same focal length. There's no deviation whatsoever. Okay, so with these first two buildings, I'm projecting from frame 0, as you can see there. So the next important principle is to maintain resolution, and that's ultimately what the layered hierarchical projection gives you. So so essentially what I'm looking for here is to maintain good resolution throughout this entire shot. Okay, so what this means, and this is the purpose of having the checkerboard pattern, is that I have some leeway with the checkerboard, because my matte painting, the artwork for my matte painting is going to be created at twice the final display resolution of my scene. So the final resolution of my scene is 1920 by 1080. So I'm going to be building my matte painting elements at 4K. So 4000 pixels by 2250, which is the same aspect ratio of 16.9, but just a little bit over twice the size. What that means is that in between each projection, I've got a little bit of contingency, in which resolution will be maintained. So in this particular case, if these squares, as the camera pushes through, the motion camera pushes through, if these squares double in size and then exceed that, then I've lost resolution and the image is starting to soften and would eventually pixelate. So I have to set my next projection just before that happens. Now you can take the X and Y coordinates of a square, move forward in time and then retake those, but it's an overkill process. It's excessive for this. I think that you can do this just by eyeballing them, and I used a really low-tech approach to this, which was just putting a ruler up against my screen in order to calculate these sizes. Now I worked out with this first image pair that the squares doubled in size round about 40 pixels. 40 frames into the scene, which means that I need to row back from that point for my next projection. So what I did is I came back to frame 30. Okay, so at frame 30, the size of these checkerboards is well within the resolution threshold that my double-sized matte painting is going to give me before we cut to the next one. So if I just jump to the next projection, which is at frame 30, for that texture, and also for the right building, then we can see that we're now projecting at from frame 30. Okay, so as this pushes through, then we maintain resolution all the way through. So what we'll be looking for now is these go completely off shot by about frame 50. So what I'd be looking to do now is make sure that the size of these squares does not double in size between 30 and 50. And I'm happy that it doesn't. It's right on the cusp. At that particular point, it's right on the cusp, but it doesn't quite exceed. Otherwise, I would be having to think about creating a final patch here. Now, I'm probably going to have to do that anyway, because if we take a look over here, for example, we can see that these tiles are actually elongating; they're widening out, which means that they're widening, which is essentially they're distorting. So effectively, that's what causes texture smearing. It causes the image to elongate due to perspective distortion, and therefore my matte painting elements would be starting to stretch at that particular point and smear across. Okay, so what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to apply some kind of patch projection towards the end of this sequence, perhaps somewhere in the frame 40 region, and by doing a little bit of overscanning. So on my shot camera, so if I kind of overscan, which is to reduce the focal length, I can pull that back quite a bit. So I'm going to get extra coverage that way. Obviously I need to make sure that my matte painting that I increase the resolution of that matte painting to compensate for the focal length change. But that's going to give me access to dealing with these, to basically patching these areas where the texture is smeared, and it'll also deal with any possible softening of the image on this orb right at the end of this shot, because obviously now we've got much more contingency in that resolution. Okay, I'll just set that back to the default of 50 frames, and now I'll come back to my scene, turn off image set A and turn on image set B. Okay, again we can see if I just choose the texture for this, okay, this is coming through the shot cam, so I need to set this to the first projection camera from frame 0, and that's what we're getting from frame 0. So again I followed that same process. I moved the timeline forward, looking for the point at which these squares doubled in size, and I found that they doubled in size around about frame 60. So obviously that's at the cusp of my resolution, so I need to come back in order to fall within the threshold, and I identified frame 50 as a good point, mainly because the facade lines between that facade and this facade on both sides is very clear and accessible to me, so if I do need to mask off my matte painting, so that's a really good natural point to do that. And of course the other thing is that I'm well within my resolution threshold, so my second projection would be at frame 50. So you see that when that's projected from frame 50, we've reinstated our resolution. This image goes off screen by about frame 90. You can see maybe just 91. And you can, so the next thing we need to do is make sure that our texture doesn't double in size between frame 50 and frame 90, and we can see that it clearly does, but that's not necessarily a problem because this needs to be patched anyway, and we can see the reason why. We can see some quite extensive smearing of the textures widening out of the checkerboards on both sides, and we can also see some real evidence of texture doubling here. This is where texture is doubling from one part of the structure onto overlapping parts of the same structure. You can see that line, for example, there is doubling across from the back side of that little protrusion there, and it's doubling out there. So we're going to need to create a patch at some point in this, towards the end of this sequence. Okay, and again I would probably be looking to do something similar to what I did on the previous image set, which is to come towards the end of the frame like this at frame 70, but then do a focal length adjustment and just pull this in, and maybe just to the point where I get my corner for the masking, so I can get a clean mask off at the on where one of the facade terminates, which as you can see there, we've got a focal length of about 36 here, and we can see that I've got that nice termination point there, and I've got that nice termination point there, so I could easily mask off my matte painting so that only this section on this side and only this section on this side get projected from this particular camera. So effectively that would patch the doubling effect here and here, but without creating any disruption to this sort of front facing facade. Okay, I'll set that back to its native, and we will move on to image set C. Okay, and here we are. Again, we take a look at the textures here. These are being projected from the shot cam, so I need to project these from the first projection camera. It's a slightly convoluted way, but I think it's good for demonstration purposes. It certainly helps me sort of work my way through this. Later on in the projection, I'm probably going to take these these rails and lamps. I'm probably going to take those off this piece of geometry and project those and create, put those onto as a separate piece of geometry and project onto those separately. And I think that because these do quite a lot of overlapping and parallaxing against, particularly on this one on the left hand side, against the main structure, and that's going to create potentially a lot of patching on the buildings behind, which I think I can avoid just simply by taking that off this piece of geometry and putting it onto its own, and then projecting that particular part of the texture separately. Okay, so again, we're following the same process. We're looking to find the sweet spot in terms of resolution that's just within the threshold. Again, by putting my ruler up against the screen, I was able to establish that from that particular point to about frame 70, that's how long it took for the squares to double in size. So again, I need to row back from that. So I rowed back to frame 60. I did that because I've already got projection camera at frame 60 that I'm using for one of the other projections. So it makes sense to be to use it, and also it gives me these cut-off points. It gives me that particular edge of that facade there, and it gives me that edge there. So these are natural points where I can mask off my matte painting if I need to, so that it kind of it populates one part of the building but not another, and the mask is nice and clean and simple, running along a division point between a facade. Okay, so that is at frame 60. If we take a look at this whole thing goes off screen by about 120. Okay, so we've got 60 frames now in which to make sure that our texture doesn't double in size further. Again, my measurement found that round about frame 90, the checks had doubled again in size, which means that again I had to roll back a little bit so that I fall within the resolution threshold, and then project again. So I've got a third projection at frame 80. So I've got a projection at 0, at 60 and at 80 on this particular shot. So if I just put the projection camera for 80 onto this, that's the right hand one. Let me just get the left hand one and do the same. Okay, so that's the projection at 80. We've got our resolution back. So now what we're looking for is to make sure that we don't lose it. And what I'm finding is by about frame 110, the checks have doubled again, and we've still got geometry visible to our shot camera. Okay, so we're definitely going to need a further projection. However, we don't necessarily need that to be part of our hierarchical layered system, and the reason for that is that we've got some clear evidence of texture smearing here with the elongation of the square of the checks, and we've also got some clear doubling here. If you look at that HE, for example, we can see that that is projecting onto that edge of this wall, but then it's doubling right across the steps, smearing as it does, and then up the wall at the other side. So there's a lot of projection artifacts at this particular point. So I'm going to be looking for a frame sort of towards the end of this sequence. So we know that we're at 120. So I'd be inclined to be coming back to sort of round about 110, maybe a bit less than that, and then getting and then doing some kind of focal length change to create overscan. That would be a good one, around about 36, because that gives me that that cut-off point there between that sort of front facing wall and this sidewards facing wall, so it would give me a good masking point there. But I can see that I also need to follow that follow that all the way up, because there's a lot of smearing going on and little bits of doubling going on up here as well. So I definitely need to do that. I've also got an area here where we can see there's shed loads of doubling going on here. That PE, for example, is going across onto that. There's a little recess here where there's some steps that go up, and that's being completely doubled across by this particular part of the texture being projected onto this building and passing straight through. So by having a patch projection camera at this frame with some overscan is going to allow me to create an image of those dimensions and then use that to patch onto that particular area, and then use masking to cut off at natural points. It may be there, it may be that I come back a little bit. I don't want to come back too far, but like there, for example, that's the building, that's the facade cut off. That gives me the facades back, but I haven't really gained that much there, and there's still going to be more area that's going to reveal itself later on in the shot that I'm not going to be able to patch properly from there. So I'm really looking to patch this sort of as late as I possibly can in the sequence and just try and be imaginative in the way that I find natural points to mask off the patch. Okay, I'll set that back to 50 and then we'll move on to the next one. So this next one, image set D, is probably the most complex of the 5 projections. And the reason for that isn't so much this building on the right, it's definitely this building on the left. And the reason for that is because over the course of the shot, I'll just set these to use the first projection camera rather than the shot camera. We can see that as the camera moves, the building on the right starts to go off screen, but we can see that the building on the left, we rotate and we finish on the building on the left. So this is kind of a hero building. Again, we can see that we've got rails and lights on both of these buildings that I can separate onto their own geometry and project separately onto those, and that'll prevent all this sort of wild and wacky parallaxing that's going on, which would necessitate dozens of patches to overcome. So I've just separate out that piece of geometry. Okay, so let's look at this projection. It's very much part of the same. I think one thing to bear in mind is that some of the foreground buildings obscure so much of this that there isn't really that much of this facade visible at all. I think the cut line comes around about there, so the stuff on the left of that doesn't really need any attention at all. Similarly there, that kind of like from there outwards is never really seen, and the same goes for the previous image set as well. But it's no problem having that information, because I am actually using a render from CG approach and then overpainting. Okay, so we follow the same approach as before. We move forward until our squares double in size. In this particular example, the checks doubled in size by about frame 90. So again, to come within a resolution threshold, I brought that back to frame 80. So if I just take that and put my pre-made projection camera, which I've done just to work through this video, and put that on each of these images, that is now a camera being projected from frame 80. Okay, so that is our resolution at 80. So we're now looking to maintain further projections within that threshold. So again, we're looking to see what doubles up between there and the next one, and I found that round about 120 that doubled up, so it made sense to have another projection round about frame 115. I'll ignore this building on the right for now, and I'll just focus on this one on the left. So I'll put the 115 projection camera onto that. So now we're projecting from 115, and again we're looking resolution wise to ensure that we don't exceed that again. And what I'm finding here is that from 115 we start to smear. So I'd be looking to get a projection round about here, so around about frame 140 at that point, because the smearing is getting to 1.5 times the size, which is quite excessive. So I'd be wanting to get a another projection onto that at that particular frame, so that we're not seeing this huge stretching or smearing of the textures. And again, once we move on further from 140 out towards the hero shot at the end, we're getting further smearing as well, and we're getting little bits of doubling in certain areas of this building. It's very shapely, this building. There's lots of recesses and protrusions, and there's a lot of texture doubling going on in these areas. So again, I want a projection camera at the end of that process to completely deal with the resolution change. So now, between 140 and 200, we don't get a significant amount of smearing or doubling in that respect. Okay, so that would address that projection. I think on the other side, on this side, that building there goes off frame by about 140. So the image being projected from 115. If we take a look at the size of the squares here, by the time we get to 140, they haven't extended sufficiently for us to lose resolution on this side. So pretty much 115 can be our very last projection for this part of the building. We don't need to consider that after that. It's just this side that needs another 2. So it needs one round about 140 and one round about 200 to maintain the resolution threshold. Okay, so I will close down image set D and open the final one, which is image set E, which comprises of these two buildings, which are currently they currently have the shot camera from from the shot camera, which doesn't really help us very much. So I'll just apply the projection camera from frame 0. So again, it's the tried and trusted process of moving forward and measuring the squares. In this particular case, these buildings are quite well back, and what looks like, when we actually look at these buildings visually, what looks on the surface like it could be quite a complex projection is actually one of the easier projections, because it is so far back in the scene that even though the camera's moving forward, the amount of perspective change and the amount of resolution change doesn't actually happen that much or that quickly. So what I found in this particular case was that the texture didn't actually double in size until round about frame 120, sorry. So a huge amount of frames to play with there, that's all being projected from that very first projection camera on frame 0. So I found at 120 that we'd pretty much doubled in size of the checkerboards. So I rode back to around about 115, which again is within the threshold. So again, if I ignore this building, because this building is fairly benign in its movement, there isn't really any significant perspective change or anything like that. So I'll just drop this on to these, so frame 115, and now we've got our resolution back on these two buildings. And then the scale didn't increase over the entire rest of the motion camera. So all we need then, therefore, is a final projection at frame 200 to maintain the resolution threshold all the way through there. Okay. So that is pretty much it for this one. Obviously there may be some issues. I'm mindful, for example, that there was a certain area where they looked like there could have been a little bit of texture stretching going on, but since I put the second projection on, I think it's so negligible that I don't think there'll be any smearing, but that's worth taking a look at once the base texture is applied. As for this side, there's virtually nothing to concern ourselves with. It should be able to, it should manage the same projection, and again this building will quite happily take projection camera 115 as its final projection. So from there, and we can see that by the time it disappears off screen, the checks haven't doubled in size, so we're well within our resolution threshold there, and we can see there's hardly any perspective change or anything like that where we may see evidence of doubling on that particular building on the right. So we should be able to achieve that projection just with 3 layered hierarchical cameras. Okay, so in essence, that's it. That's how I went about sort of working out my projection camera strategy. Certainly in terms of the layered projection. I think I've resolved probably 80% of the problems going through that process. I find strategizing this very useful. I think the process forces a kind of low-level analysis of the shot, the camera movement, the various geometric structures in play, and it allows exploration and testing of different projection scenarios before any time and effort is committed to producing artwork. Most of the areas that are likely to be affected have already been identified, and a cursory inspection of those areas should reveal how this is impacting on the actual texture and what corrective action will be necessary. However, there's also likely to be additional projection artifacts, I've already mentioned this, that are simply just too subtle to notice when you're using a checkerboard texture. Therefore, it'd be necessary to undertake more of a pixel level inspection of the artwork through all the frames of the sequence once a base texture has been applied.